Hey guys, so today I'm here with a full review of the Sony PlayStation 1. Now back in the early 90s, video gaming was a very different place. Back then if you wanted to play a video game, more than likely you were going to go ahead and grab your Super Nintendo or your Sega Genesis. However, as soon as the Sony PlayStation came around, it really was a revolution as far as just in so many different ways, and of course kicked off the extremely successful PlayStation brand that continues even to this day with the PlayStation 3. So anyway guys, I'm going to go ahead and give you guys a full review and tell you all about the original PlayStation that really kicked it all off. One of the many defining features of the original PlayStation was the fact that it actually did use CDs for the games. So this might not seem like much today, but if you take a look at it, even today we do use discs. Of course, they're either DVDs or Blu-rays in the case of the Xbox and the PlayStation 3, but still it is in this disc format, and that was a really big boost because, I mean, back in the early 90s, I mean, almost any game you wanted to play was going to be on a cartridge similar to the Sega Genesis. Now, obviously, you can tell there's a big difference, but one of the other differences was just the fact that actually these cartridges cost quite a bit of money to make, because as you see here, you actually have the full plastic shell, everything like that. Whereas the CD, I mean, costs literally next to nothing to go ahead and produce. And yeah, I know before I get a bunch of comments, I do realize that the Genesis did have, was actually able to have the Sega CD and use the CD games. But of course, that was a big difference. You know, the Genesis really didn't have the power to fully utilize a CD. You know, it was just basically filled with, you know, basically better music. Whereas the PlayStation 1 actually was able to go ahead and use the CD format to its fullest extent and actually, you know, fill it up with lots of really nice looking 3D graphics. Another really good feature about the PlayStation was the fact that it actually used memory cards. So, you know, again, back in the day, you really didn't have memory cards or anything like that. And while actually, obviously, we don't use memory cards today, it still, of course, has evolved into hard drives, which is a pretty nice feature. And actually, the Xbox 360, or at least up until very recently, did actually have memory cards. So the really cool thing about the PlayStation is that you could go ahead, plug in a memory card, play and save your games, and then all I had to do is just take out the memory card, go over to maybe your friend's house or whatever, and pop it right in, and that game would remember exactly where you were, which is a pretty cool deal back then. Taking a look around the unit, you'll see that it was a fairly generic looking, it wasn't really all that stylish like some consoles today, but of course it didn't look bad at all, and, you know, still has kind of a bit of a charm to it. So taking a look at the front, we do of course have two memory card slots as well as slots for two controllers. Turning it over on the sides, you'll see nothing but just a couple of really large vents. And on the original PlayStation, I'll go ahead and just take a look here, you actually did have one port right here, which was behind this. Not a whole lot utilized this port, but, you know, it was kind of there. They actually did remove it when they created the PS1. If I just did that off. So we do have a serial port right here, as well as the audio video out, and the power cable. The top of it's actually fairly unique looking. You do have one very large power button. Man, I did that so many times. Of course, the open button to go ahead and get into your CD and swap that out. And over here you do have just a pretty simple reset button. Something the PlayStation 1 had in common with current consoles was that there were a ton of different versions. Now, the way you can tell is obviously by just flipping it over and you can take a look at the model number. So, for example, this one is a 5501. But the thing with the original PlayStations, though, was that it rarely was a big deal. Generally, they did make a lot of changes, but almost always these changes were pretty minor. You know, they might have consisted of, you know, maybe trying to block out different kinds of mod chips, which was a pretty big issue with the PS1. As well as maybe, you know, changing out what kind of disk drive, etc., etc. But in general, pretty much any PlayStation show are practically the same. And actually, if we go ahead and take a look here, if you go ahead and look down here, you actually see when the console was made. So that's a really cool thing. So you can actually see here, you know, if you want to know that, you know, maybe it was made in 1995, 1998, whatever you want. So when you're looking to buy a PlayStation, it's definitely pays to go ahead and flip it over. The model number doesn't so much matter, but take a look at when it was made. It's kind of interesting to know. The original PlayStation 1 was a really fantastic console. It was one of the most successful of all times, only really being beat out mainly by the PlayStation 2. And it really did so many things well. I mean, back in the early 90s, it was a CD player, and of course this actually was my first ever CD player. You know, it had a lot of different features, it had really good graphics, and it was really ahead of its time. And as such, it did really tremendously well. So I really do recommend, if you've never had a PlayStation 1, definitely go pick one up. They're dirt cheap these days because Sony made so many millions upon millions of them. And they're really fun consoles to own and really fun consoles to play. However, if you're not really interested in them, of course you can go ahead and play PS1 games on any kind of PlayStation 2 as well as any kind of PlayStation 3. So even if you don't want to go out here and buy one of these great consoles, you can go ahead and get almost the exact same experience by playing all the really, of course, the games are cheap as well, but you can play all these games on any of these really modern PlayStations. Anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed the review. Thanks for watching.